Welcome to the stage, co-founder and former CEO of Duo Security, Doug Song.
All right, hello. All right, so I want to talk about Detroit, but I'll start with a confession, because I'm actually not a Detroiter. I didn't grow up here. I'm not black in the blackest city in America, and I'm certainly not a historian, so I'll start with that. So I don't pretend to tell the whole story of Detroit. There's so many stories here, and they're often deeply layered, often painful, and always fiercely held by those who live them. But what I share today is a little bit different. Not so much a history lesson, but what I've learned from Detroit about reinvention, grit, and building things that actually matter. So I'm guessing that most of you here at Summit are like me, we're kind of misfits, right? Something like that? And I think actually most Asian Americans are, because we're too American for a monocultural Korea, or too Asian for a racially binary America. And so we often find ourselves in the conflict, or the crossfire, or at the edges of things. And actually, by the way, Korean identity is mostly built around this aspect called Han, which is sort of this unresolved suffering and resentment, multi-generationally, actually, like 5,000 years of that. And so if you have any Korean friends, just know that about them. We all need therapists. Except for the guys in the front. Anybody guess where I grew up, if not Detroit? No? No guesses? So Baltimore. So I grew up, and my dad had a liquor store in Baltimore. And I had some difficulty. I experienced some violence early. My dad was carjacked outside the store. I lost him when I was 18. And so sometimes that Han is actually warranted. And so all my teenage hobbies were kind of forms of ritualized violence of some kind. Skateboarding, punk rock, graffiti, hacking. But also learning by doing, right? Like many of us do here in community. And actually hacking was the one thing I did that actually was commercially viable. I was part of an international hacking group called Woo Woo. We were led by this 15-year-old Mormon kid in the front there named Shock. Kind of weird, but we broke and built many things. And actually some of those projects turned out, to be companies and so forth. Our crew gave rise to the founders of Napster, Facebook, WhatsApp, and my company called Duo Security. And so over 8 years, we built Duo up and became Michigan's first tech unicorn, first multi-billion-dollar exit. And though we started in Ann Arbor 30 miles away, we had an office here in Detroit as well, just a few blocks away. And I'll tell you, I couldn't have built this company anywhere else. Right? Really, we're built from what was strategic about this place. And so I'll share with you a little bit of what I learned from here. So the first here is that when we talk about reinvention, and Detroit is a city that has reinvented itself over and over again multiple times, here it really starts with rupture. And in fact, it's encoded right in our city flag. The city flag commemorates the Great Fire of 1805, which shows two women in the foreground. One who weeps for the destruction of the city, and one who looks forward to the future. And the Latin motto there saying, speramus meliora, resurgit cineribus, means we hope for better things, it will arise from the ashes. And so literally and figuratively, this city has been rebuilt many times over the 300 years, or really 1,000 years, right, including the indigenous people on this land first. And we stumble, we fall, but we always get back up every time, and that's what we're doing here in Detroit today. And you see the legacy of that. In the flag here, the fleur-de-lis, just as a bit of trivia, that's for the French and Cadillac in 1701. The lions for the British, who came in and took over the fur trade. And the stars and stripes for the Americans, right, who stayed. And so Detroit didn't really evolve quietly. It really changed in these explosions. Because things break. And what Detroit teaches us is that we can make them beautiful again. We don't throw anything away what's broken. We make it stronger. We make it more honest. We make it ours. And so in 1805, that Great Fire burned the whole city to the ground. There's one building left standing. And this fellow, Judge Augustus Woodward, he introduced a radial street plan inspired by L'Enfant's design for D.C. So if you've been to D.C., you've seen all those terrible traffic circles and all the radial things and all that. So it's a very distinctive street grid and civic architecture. Well, it turns out here in Detroit, all those spokes existed first as Native American trading routes. The parks came from L'Enfant, but those were here first. And they stopped following that plan after 20 years. We have this weird grid laid out too, you'll see, as we go to New Lab and Michigan Central Station today. But fun fact, if you ever wondered where the marker for where 8 Mile Road is 8 miles from, right here in Campus Martius Park is a glass circle where they still have the original surveying stake. So that still sits there, and you can see where that is. And so that reinvention has happened a couple times. Another was, the Great Depression, which decimated Detroit's economy and labor base. But what people don't know is that Detroit was one of the richest cities in America. Right? We soared before we crashed. And in 1910, our population was almost 500,000 people, but by 1930 it was 1.6 million. No city in the history of the world had ever grown that quickly before, which makes our fall even harder. And still today, when bad things happen, they tend to happen worse, actually, in Detroit. When the country gets a cold, we get the flu. But the reinvention that happened here was really as a result of World War II, when Detroit's auto industry was retooled to build all the tanks, bombers, and munitions at a scale never seen before. And the first tank plant, right, was built here when the Germans had the Panzers. When Roosevelt asked, the president of GM, can you build me a bomber every week? He said, I'll build you one every hour. And we did. There's a great book called Freedom's Forge by Arthur Herman that tells that story of how Detroit leaders heeded the call and saved the free world. But the legacy of that is it really cemented Detroit's role as the beating heart of America's industrial war machine, but also post-war middle class. And that led to some other things here. So in the 1950s, there was this urban renewal happening all around the country, and it took out most of what's here. We're sitting here in what was Paradise Valley and Black Bottom, which were self-sufficient black economic and cultural ecosystems, wiped out for highways and stadiums, all fueling a mistrust in city government. It led to one of the most destructive civil uprisings in US history because it was rooted in racial injustice, police brutality, and systemic disinvestment. What that led to, on the other side of it though, was new movements for black political leadership, community organizing, and urban self-determination. The legacy of that is Detroit elected its first black mayor in 1973, Coleman Young, and seeded a whole new generation of black civic and cultural leaders. Fast forward to the 70s when we had this oil crisis. After those big cars we built and the big margins we had all failed in this fuel-constrained world, we all had to shift toward a fuel efficiency, automation, and early mobility R&D. And that really opened the door for all the future innovations in mobility tech and electrification. And in this era, the rupture of all the auto bankruptcies, and GM, Chrysler, Detroit was the first city to have this scale of municipal bankruptcy, $18 billion municipal bankruptcy. But all that led to a new era of public-private reinvestment, some of which you're seeing the results of today, land banks, creative reuse strategies, which you also see today too. And it really opened space and made space for grassroots placemaking, black-owned development, and new experiments in city systems like those land banks and urban farming. And if you haven't seen something called Detroit Future City, I encourage you to check it out. It was written some time ago as a collective experiment by a bunch of city folks and community folks to build a 50-year plan for the city in 5-year increments with developers, private interests, philanthropy all coming together to figure out what we were all doing collectively and what a shared vision for the city could actually be. And what's that led to is a pretty interesting revitalization that you're seeing. And so all this reinvention, it isn't about just fixing what's broken, right? It's about who we become in the process of repair. So hopefully you saw Dan Gilbert on stage, Thursday. He only bought his first building here in 2011, right? Now he owns like 70% of downtown, right? And he took a bet, big bet on the city when no one else would. And that courage to do so and double down on Detroit has inspired so many people to follow. So what you see on the left was the old Hudson's, right? This is a department store that was one of the most, again, successful retail operations in the US that now is this gleaming Salesforce tower without a Salesforce, but hopefully we'll get one at some point. And other things have now happened, including Bill Ford Jr., the Ford family, whose nearly $1 billion redevelopment of the Michigan Central Station left so many people in tears when it opened. And you might also be, right, if you go visit this afternoon and see and learn its history. because it was bleak, I got to tell you. It was, when they renovated this other building you'll hopefully also go to called New Lab, there's a dead body they found in this place, right? They had to excavate before they did all this work. But this is all to say that this opportunity for reinvention, like I said, is more than just repair. This is Grace Lee Boggs, who spent 70 years as an activist in Detroit. She was a prominent Chinese American in the Black Power movement. I think she said it best: these are the times to grow our souls. And she believed that real revolution begins in place, in neighborhoods, in porches, in school lots. She didn't just love Detroit, she listened to it. And she saw the city not as a problem to fix, but really a place to practice the future. And what she taught was really that reinvention was not just about repair, but spiritual and creative opportunity. So that really is what Detroit is at its root, right? Detroit's a place where we put soul in the machine. We don't just build machines, we build meaning into them. And so hopefully if you do come back, I think most of you probably here, most of the folks at the conference certainly are new to Detroit. You got to go to Motown Museum, and it's sort of like a spiritual kind of place. But it wasn't just a record label. It actually was a production system for emotion. It was founded in 1959 in a very deeply segregated Detroit where black musicians couldn't even play white-owned venues or labels, yet they created a sound that transcended racial barriers and it redefined American culture. And that raw, unfiltered expression of black music run through a process as structured as any assembly line on Jefferson Avenue. That's how these songs were really tested and cut across race and class. And Barry Gorder Jr. said, if the janitor didn't dance, we didn't ship the record. And this was really Detroit's unique genius, right? It fused discipline with feeling, structure with swing. You have these classically trained writers working with gospel singers and jazz players all together in that magnificent sound. And so Motown really gave us a blueprint for how to systemize creativity without stripping it of humanity. And even today, Detroit's best innovations carry that tension, precision, meeting emotion. And if Motown was soul engineered into a system, Detroit techno was the opposite, right? These guys were hackers, actually. Right? It was a system they hacked to create new forms of soul. So in the 80s, this group of 3 young black renegades of electronic funk, in this post-industrial Detroit, Juan Atkins, Kevin Saunderson, Derek May, they took the tools of automation and claps, these drum machines and synths, and they created something completely new, techno. And someone tried to tell me that techno is a Chicago thing. I was like, no. House, okay, but But where Motown really, shot for that crossover appeal, techno is really a futurist manifesto, right? Afrofuturism, rooted in science fiction and Detroit's urban decay, really encoded as rhythm, making new worlds from these abandoned ones. I think Derek once described techno as George Clinton and Kraftwerk stuck in an elevator. But it wasn't just this blend of styles, it was a reclamation of machine logic to express blackness, alienation, and imagination. Because this was a city where the factories were shutting down. And yet, in these bedrooms and basements, these folks were creating new music. And if Motown was a soul in the machine and techno was a soul against the machine, there's Jay Dilla, right, who sort of bent time inside the machine. Yeah. Yes. And musicians, they call it Dilla time, right? This sort of slouching, swinging, kind of perfectly imperfect rhythm that changed not only how hip-hop and neo-soul, but even jazz would feel forever. And he didn't just play the beat, he reprogrammed those rules of time. And Dilla's magic wasn't just genius, it was how he pulled from everywhere. Right? He pulled from gospel and jazz and funk and Detroit house. It was how he made music with people, not just for people. And that experimental swing influenced a whole generation of artists who turned those techniques into new genres, and it shows how even the most personal breakthroughs could ripple outward through community, collaboration, and cultural inheritance. And so another lesson from Detroit is really that innovation is collective, right? You get these heroes, but also what led from those innovations. And so in Ford's case, we all know the story, but Ford's line, it needed everybody, every worker doing their part, kind of coordinated like an orchestra. And the special thing about manufacturing was it offered a job to everybody. But when the system broke down for workers, Detroit invented another kind of innovation, which is organized labor, right? It birthed the American middle class. Because UAW wasn't just about wages, it was about dignity and equity and a say in helping the system that you helped to build. And that collective innovation is innovation. It was changing not really products, but power structures, right, to reorganize power and possibility. And that's why Detroit really didn't stop at economic power. It turned that collective action into moral force. In June of '63, months before the March on Washington, Martin Luther King Jr. marched first here, down Woodward, with over 125,000 people in the Walk to Freedom. It was the largest civil rights demonstration in American history up to that point. It's where he previewed his I Have a Dream speech, right here in Detroit. And he didn't do that alone. He did that with UAW President Walter Reuther, ministers, musicians, community organizers, because Detroit understood and understands something. You can't innovate a future unless you're willing to organize for justice. And the civil rights movement in Detroit wasn't just about protest. It was about designing these new systems of housing, of schools, of jobs, and of dignity. Now, when it came to building my company, I was thinking about where I would do it, and of course I had investors from California like, when you come into California, like I'm going to be the last one to turn off the lights or something. And, in my opinion, every great startup needs freaks, geeks, and jocks, right? You need the weirdos who question everything. You need the geeks, right? The builders and the hackers. You need the jocks, right? The fighters, the organizers who push it forward. And I really don't think I could have built my company anywhere else because I needed all three. In part because I believe this is actually how you grow a business, right, to scale. In some sense, the process of hypergrowth for a company is about constant reinvention. I used to tell my team that every year we're effectively a new company when you look around and half the people are new, right, doubling the team every year. It's a ship of Theseus, right, changing all the parts, but hopefully the same soul. And reinvention isn't just about those tools for change, it's really about the values that don't. You probably can't read all this, but this was my kind of formula for my company, right? Our purpose, our mission, our vision, our values, all this. It's a culmination of all the history and skills, motivation and values shaped by this place. Because for 8 intense years, we worked to protect others from harm, right? We were a cybersecurity company, that was our role. But by democratizing it, right? For not the 1% of the banks, hospitals, governments they were sold to, but the 99% of all these smaller businesses, universities, nonprofits, et cetera. And my focus as CEO was really, I'm a product, culture, and brand CEO. I believe product is value to my customers, culture is our value to our employees, and brand is the external representation of those first two. Dan Gilbert once told me there's no creativity in a spreadsheet. I think he expressed some of that also on Thursday. And like Dilla as well, you sort of innovate with feel over formula, and the score will take care of itself. Of all of these core values we had one that was, I think, very Detroit, which is to be kinder than necessary, or to go out of our way to help each other be successful. Because culture drives behavior and behavior drives results, if you can imagine a world or a company where everyone is out to help each other, not get each other, you can see how fast things can really succeed. And so this reinvention is really a mindset, right? It's not a point in time. And Detroit isn't a comeback story, it's really a continuing story. Detroit reinvents because it never stops asking what else is possible. Detroit reinvents because it remembers where it is and who all this is for. And so know that here we have to invest in people, not just buildings. You see all the artifacts in the buildings, and this is great, place matters, but so does belonging. And so we have many, many more new buildings coming. In the last year, there have been over, several billion, actually, of new projects announced. This one is University of Michigan's Center for Innovation. It started here in the 1800s before it moved to Ann Arbor, 30 miles away. But bringing the campus back here and establishing sustainability, advanced computing, urban tech, this will be a wonderful asset for the community. We also have the Henry Ford Health and the MSU Future Health Center, which is a $3 billion campus, uniting health, equity, and innovation. And this is really around where research, housing, and community impact come together. Gilbert is extending here with a 14-acre life sciences, technology, and entrepreneurship district. He mentioned the Shirley Ryan Ability Lab and so forth, and some of the most advanced theranostics centers in the world here. And there's even more eds and meds coming. So, Wayne State is building another health sciences research center. So there's a lot of this stuff happening. And in this mix, right, of all these new buildings, hubs, campuses, districts, all around innovation spread across the city, we're trying to do a thing too. So we have a new project here to help try to connect the dots, and it's right here downtown. And it's a critical piece of the puzzle, I think, because while Detroit's rich in physical capital, human capital, intellectual capital, and cultural capital, what we need more of, and could use your help with this as well, is social capital, right, which connects all that. Because we were the first unicorn and the first multi-million exit here in 2018, but since then, there have been many, many more. All but the last 3 were here in Metro Detroit. Problem is, none of them, except for StockX, were actually in Detroit. And there's lots of reasons why, and I think, again, maybe Detroit wasn't ready at the time for companies not just to start here, but to scale here, but I think we are now. And so we're investing, as a family office, in that next generation of local founders, right? Trying to be the friends of family money for a lot of folks whose friends and family don't have money to invest this way. Actually, the bottom 2 on the right here, they just moved to Detroit. We just brought them up from Austin and from Indiana. And so it's happening. In fact, this is the second year in a row in which Detroit finally grew, right, its population versus shrink. And part of it's that because there's a movement happening, right? We helped to fund an organization called Black Tech Saturdays, which grew from Johnny Alexa Turnage to 12,000 people right here in the city, really building a culture and a community and a platform for tech in the city that is authentically Detroit. This is going on to its second year. But across the city, it's not just in the downtown, it's in the neighborhoods too. The Durfee Innovation Center, which is an old school that was also reinvented, right, into a thriving community center. This is one of the neighborhoods in Detroit where, when they survey residents about where they're feeling like they're supported and they feel like they're thriving in their lives, this is one of the top, if not the top, neighborhoods, even though it's also not necessarily one of the richest. Anchor Detroit is also happening over on the east side, matching up with the west side. And there's an arts campus here. I wish we would all go there, but the Shepherd and Little Village on Detroit's east side. It's anchored by this century-old Romanesque church that serves as a multifunction kind of cultural arts center, galleries, library, a cool skate park. I'm a skateboarder, but Tony Hawk built this thing. It's pretty good. And so as you think about, in the face of all this change, what are those lessons of Detroit's reinvention that we need to carry forward that are more important than ever? Because this sign here, this is just up the street, Detroit, the new Silicon Valley of America. You don't need another Silicon Valley, I think, in this country. What we need are a lot more Detroits, frankly.
Yeah. Yes.
And the way that we do that is what MLK said, right, when he showed up for his Walk for Freedom. We need to walk together. We need to talk together. We need to work together. And for the last year, we've been collaborating with the owners of one of very few remaining Black-owned buildings downtown, trying to pull together the community of support around how do we build something for the community. So we have dozens of community partners and stakeholders as you rethink how can we reinvent our innovation economy here in Detroit. Because the next unicorn here, I believe, statistically speaking, ought to be Black. So let me take a quick pause here to show you something. So this project is called the Mothership. And it is an Afrofuturist hub for tech and innovation that's going to be here in downtown Detroit with community partners from across the city. The goal here is to create a density, right, of startups, of capital, of community. and help build, again, the next generation of companies that will build this city. Because reinvention is a Detroit tradition, but it's also a call, right? What can we build that carries soul, not just scale? And what if we all build companies the way that Detroit makes music, with roots and rhythm and meaning? And what if we cared more for the soul and not just the math of business? My friend Stephen McGee, you'll see him if you go to New Lab. He's doing some portrait sessions for people at New Lab today. But he says that Detroit is the Paris of the 20s, the Berlin of the 80s, the San Francisco of the 60s. It's a place to build. Detroit is built to build. As my friend Jeanette Pierce says, Detroit is big enough to matter in the world, but also small enough for you to matter in it. And so it's an invitation. I'll just say, the best advice I ever got was this: if faced with two choices in life, do whatever makes for the better story, right? Because that's all we got in life. And my great hope here is that your Detroit story will continue beyond Summit. And I just want you to know that you'll always have friends here ready to help to make that happen when you are. So with that, thank you for coming. Thank you for coming to Detroit, spending your time here, meeting our folks here, getting involved. And do remember these stories as you go and see New Lab, the station today, and meet more local Detroiters who've been part of all this and carrying the water for all this time. Thank you.